Welcome to the research desk.
It's good to be here.
So how did a small republic on the edge of Europe, an incredibly tiny geographical footprint, build the most valuable company the world had ever seen?
Right, and it wasn't just spices. I mean, spices are the headline, but it was really about building a permanent corporate memory.
Exactly. Today we are looking at the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, which was chartered in 1602. And if you look back at the 17th century, it is incredibly easy to attribute the staggering wealth of this enterprise solely to the sheer consumer value of the commodities.
Pepper, cloves, nutmeg.
Right. Nutmeg, mace, cinnamon. Those goods obviously produced astonishing margins. I mean, if you could successfully move them from Asian markets to European consumers, you were going to be rich.
But, and this is a huge but, spices had been valuable long before 1602. We really have to remember that the Portuguese, the Arabs, the Indian and Mali merchants, the Javanese, the Chinese, even the Venetians, they already understood the routes.
Right. They weren't discovering a blank map.
Exactly. They knew the ports. They understood the physical commodities intimately. So the unique Dutch advantage was absolutely not the discovery of consumer demand.
No, it wasn't. The advantage was purely structural. They built what we would recognize today as really the world's first information industrial complex.
I like that phrasing.
Yeah. They engineered a corporate machine massive enough to gather all this scattered, localized maritime knowledge and then, critically, synthesize it into a permanent operational memory.
And that brings us to the central tension we are going to explore today.
Which is how this exact architecture, this machine, that allowed them to effectively remember the ocean, eventually accumulated so much administrative weight that the company became too heavy to keep learning from the very data it collected.
The sheer mechanics of the VOC are fascinating. I mean, truly unprecedented. But we have to rigorously stress this premise that it was purely a business innovation.
You think it was something else?
Well, when we examine the eventual decay of the VOC, the inescapable weight of its fixed costs, and, the bureaucratic paralysis that defined its later decades, we are looking at a deeply ingrained pattern.
A pattern of institutional decay.
Yes, it is a pattern that forces us to ask whether the life cycle of a massive information monopoly always ends in administrative exhaustion. And I want to connect this historical arc directly to modern platform monopolies today.
Like Amazon or TSMC.
Exactly. Because the architecture of the VOC is the exact blueprint for today's data-driven titans. The question for the listener is whether the pattern of decay always repeats when a system optimizes for control over adaptability.
That is the core question. But to understand the brilliance of the VOC's model in the first place, we cannot just look at what they built. We have to look at the fatal flaw of the system they replaced.
The pre-1602 world.
Right. Before 1602, long-distance trade was sophisticated, but the European blind spot was fundamentally organizational. I mean, the Portuguese had rounded the Cape of Good Hope long before the Dutch.
Decades before.
Right, and they built the Estado da India, which was essentially a crown-controlled chain of fortresses and naval passes.
But for the actual merchant syndicates attempting these voyages, the business model was entirely fragmented.
How so? Explain the syndicate model.
So a group of investors would pool their money to finance a single ship, just one. They would hire a captain, load the hull of trade goods, send it off, and basically pray the cargo returned. That single voyage syndicate model was the absolute standard in Europe.
And the critical issue at that standard was that a voyage to Asia was intensely information heavy. I mean, every single voyage produced vital maritime intelligence.
It wasn't just about steering a ship.
Exactly. A captain learned the precise location of favorable seasonal currents. He learned the shifting prices of surplus pepper in a specific port.
Or the political disposition of a local ruler.
Right, or even the disease patterns that decimated crews on certain islands.
But under the single voyage syndicate model, that knowledge effectively died with the voyage.
It evaporated.
Completely. Because the syndicate dissolved when the ship returned and the profits were distributed. There was no mechanism to retain the intelligence. The ocean was effectively an environment without a corporate memory. Every new syndicate was essentially starting from scratch.
They were just buying fragmented maps and relying on the personal memories of whatever crew they could scrape together.
Which brings us to the Dutch experience in the 1590s. It perfectly illustrates the crisis of that fragmentation.
Right, because for decades, The Dutch had just been acting as European middlemen. They were perfectly happy redistributing the spices that came through the Portuguese port of Lisbon.
It was a very comfortable, highly profitable arrangement. They didn't need to sail to Asia because the Portuguese were bringing the goods right to Europe.
But then the geopolitical landscape completely fractured.
1580.
Yes, in 1580, Spain and Portugal united under the Iberian crown. And at the same time, the Dutch were actively fighting a brutal war of independence against Spain.
The 80 Years' War.
Exactly. So access to those Portuguese spice flows in Lisbon suddenly became politically fragile. And eventually, it was cut off completely.
The Dutch spice brokers faced an existential threat. They were forced to send their own fleets to Asia just to secure their own supply.
Which led to the incredible 1595 voyage of Cornelis de Houtman. He was backed by one of these early syndicates, the pre-companies or the VOR company. And
A terrible voyage by all accounts.
an operational nightmare. He took 4 ships and set out for Indonesia. He suffered heavy losses of men to scurvy, internal conflict, skirmishes.
He barely made it back to Amsterdam in 1597. I think he only had 3 heavily damaged ships left.
And a very, very modest cargo of pepper and nutmeg.
The actual profits from that specific voyage were totally negligible, barely covered the costs.
But the impact of the voyage was earth-shattering. Houtman proved the route was viable for Dutch ships. He proved that they could bypass the Portuguese blockades and deal directly with the source in the Indonesian archipelago.
And that proof of concept triggered an absolute gold rush in the Dutch Republic.
Suddenly, you had dozens of these competing Dutch pre-companies popping up in different cities. Amsterdam, Zeeland, Rotterdam, they were all raising capital for single voyages, all rushing to build ships and all racing to the East Indies.
And the result was entirely predictable.
Total economic disaster.
Think about the basic supply and demand mechanics of what happened here. You have dozens of heavily armed Dutch ships arriving at the exact same spice ports in Java and the Maluku Islands simultaneously.
Right, all at once.
Yes, and they are all competing against each other to buy the exact same limited supply of nutmeg and cloves.
So the local Asian merchants, who were not stupid, simply let the Dutch bid against each other.
Exactly. The internal competition drove the purchase prices astronomically high in Asia.
And then, months later, those exact same Dutch ships arrived back in Amsterdam at roughly the exact same time.
Dumping a massive combined supply of spices onto the European market.
And the selling prices absolutely crashed.
The opportunity was real, but the fragmented capital structure of the Dutch syndicates was actively destroying the underlying economics of the trade.
They were cannibalizing their own margins because they could not coordinate their information or their capital.
Which perfectly sets up the 1602 solution.
Yes, the 1602 Charter. This is where the Dutch political leadership, the States General, stepped in. They realized that maritime intelligence was completely useless if it could not be accumulated and acted upon at scale.
Right. A route report only matters if the next captain can actually use it.
And a price signal in Java only generates leverage if the entity receiving it has the capital to coordinate the supply back in Europe without crashing the market.
So the States General essentially forced a shotgun marriage.
They compelled all these competing, localized pre-companies to merge into a single national vehicle, the VOC.
They established 6 regional chambers to keep all the cities happy. Amsterdam, Zeeland, Delft, Rotterdam, Hoorn, and Enkhuizen.
Though Amsterdam naturally held the dominant position, and at the top of this whole structure sat the Heren 17.
The Gentleman's 17.
Right, the board of 17 directors representing those regional chambers. But the true innovation, the thing that literally changed the history of global business, was the capital structure.
The joint stock model.
Yes. When they charted the VOC, they opened a public subscription book. Anyone could invest. And they raised roughly 6.4 million guilders.
We really need to pause on that number. To put 6.4 million guilders in perspective, that was an unprecedented financial war chest for a private enterprise at the time.
It was staggering.
It absolutely dwarfed the initial capital of the English East India Company, which had just been founded 2 years prior in 1600.
But more importantly than the sheer size, This capital was permanent. In the old syndicate model, investors got their principal and profit back the moment the ship returned. The capital pool drained.
But with the VOC, the capital stayed inside the company permanently.
Investors received tradable shares instead of a direct payout of the cargo. If an investor wanted their money back, they didn't force the company to liquidate a ship's hull of pepper.
They simply went to the Amsterdam Stock Exchange and sold their share to another investor.
Exactly. The capital was locked in the machine. But, and I know you have thoughts on this is where we really need to look at the other side of the coin.
I do, because this is where I want to introduce a serious counter-perspective. Characterizing the 1602 Charter strictly as a brilliant business innovation sanitizes what was actually happening on the ground.
You mean the state involvement?
Yes, if you are listening to this and picturing the VOC as just an early, aggressive version of a modern multinational corporation, a bunch of merchants in a boardroom, you are completely missing the geopolitical reality.
How so? Frame that for us.
Because this was not a modern corporation cleanly separated from the state. It was a state-delegated sovereign weapon.
A weapon?
Absolutely. The 1602 Charter granted the VOC the explicit authority to build forts, make treaties with foreign powers, administer distant territories, mint its own coins, appoint officials, and wage war.
Those are the powers of a sovereign nation.
Precisely.
But the powers were sovereign, certainly, but they were granted specifically to protect the commercial enterprise. They needed those powers to secure the monopoly.
I would argue it was the exact other way around. The Dutch state lacked the centralized imperial bureaucracy of a country like Spain or Portugal.
Right, the Dutch Republic was essentially just a loose confederation of cities.
It did not have the internal capacity or, honestly, the tax base to project state power across the globe and fight the Iberian Empire on multiple oceans. So it outsourced its geopolitical survival to a private entity that could raise private capital.
You are suggesting the VOC was effectively a proxy navy funded by private shareholders.
Exactly. That is exactly what it was. Was this genuinely a business innovation? Or just the state weaponizing private capital to fight a war against Spain and Portugal?
It's a fair question.
The permanent capital structure you just praised so highly wasn't just necessary for buying spices. It was necessary because you cannot fund a permanent military presence, build stone fortresses in Asia, and maintain a standing naval fleet on a single voyage syndicate budget.
No, you can't.
The state needed permanent capital to fund permanent violence.
Okay, the geopolitical utility of the VOC to the Dutch Republic is undeniable. I'll grant you that. But the sovereign powers were fundamentally subordinate to the information and commercial architecture of the company.
You think the business drove the war, not the other way around?
I do, because a proxy navy still needs to pay dividends to its shareholders, or the public capital dries up immediately.
That is true.
Permanent capital solved the funding problem, but 6.4 million guilders just sitting in an account in Amsterdam was totally useless without an operational brain to direct it across the globe.
And that operational brain had to be situated in Asia, not Europe.
Because of the communication delay, the latency was simply too vast.
Right. Which brings us to the crucial middle layer of this entire machine, Batavia.
Founded in 1619 by Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Koon on the island of Java. And Batavia was not just a trading port where ships stopped to pick up water.
It was the Asian control room.
Exactly. Koon recognized very early on that simply sailing a ship from Amsterdam to Asia, filling a hull with spices, and sailing back was financially wildly inefficient.
Why?
Because the outward voyage from Europe carried very little that Asian markets actually wanted to buy. The Europeans basically just had to ship raw silver to pay for the spices. It was a massive capital drain.
So to solve that silver drain, the VOC built a highly complex, interconnected intra-Asian trading network.
They didn't just extract goods for Europe. They actually became the dominant merchant marine within Asia itself.
They used Japanese silver and copper to buy Indian textiles.
Right, and then they traded those Indian textiles for Indonesian spices and Ceylonese cinnamon.
They also dealt in Chinese porcelain, Persian silk. The scope of it is wild.
They were essentially acting as the central clearinghouse for Asian commerce. They used the profits from one Asian market to finance their own operations in another.
which completely altered the capital requirements of the entire enterprise. Suddenly, they didn't need to ship massive amounts of silver from Amsterdam every single year.
Batavia became entirely self-funding.
And managing that sprawling intra-Asian network required a telemetry system that was just light years ahead of its time.
We are talking about a reporting structure that tracked over 8,000 direct voyages between Europe and Asia over the company's lifespan. And it was all meticulously documented.
Think about the sheer volume of paperwork involved in that.
It's hard to fathom.
This is a time long before telegraphs or digital networks. Every single captain, every merchant, every military commander, and every local clerk was mandated to generate a standardized flow of data by hand.
They produced detailed ship logs. They generated granular cargo accounts,
Localized price reports,
political intelligence on local rulers, updated route knowledge. All of this data flowed from the outer edges of the Asian network back to the control room in Batavia.
and Batavia had to synthesize it all. They compiled what were called the Generale Missiven.
The general missives.
Right. These are massive, comprehensive annual reports sent from the Governor-General in Batavia back to the Heeren 17 in Amsterdam. They summarize the entire political, military, and commercial state of the VOC world.
The company literally turned its daily operations into an archive-producing machine.
Because that archive was the competitive moat.
Let's look at how this machine actually learned from its data. Because you can clearly see a 6-gear operational flywheel at work here.
Walk us through the gears.
Okay, gear 1. Permanent capital funded repeated exposure, meaning a single sunken ship did not bankrupt the enterprise.
Gear 2.
The state-backed monopoly eliminated internal Dutch competition, ensuring they held their pricing power back in Europe.
Right, no crashing the market.
Gear 3. The vast Asian network acted as a field intelligence apparatus. Every single trading post served as a sensor, gathering proprietary data on local harvest yields, monsoon winds, and political shifts.
And Gear 4 is Batavia.
Exactly. Batavia aggregated that intelligence and made the localized routing and procurement decisions. They were the routing layer.
Gear 5?
Amsterdam and the regional chambers processed the macro-level intelligence from the General Missiven to optimize their financing, allocate ships for the next season, and distribute dividends to keep the investors happy.
And we'll get to Gear 6 in a moment, but it sounds like a perfect, frictionless loop when you describe it that way.
It was incredibly effective for a long time.
But you have to look at the massive glaring flaw in that design, the principal-agent problem.
The distance between the owners and the operators.
Exactly. If Batavia is making the operational decisions on the ground in Asia, and the Heeren 17 in Amsterdam are reading the aggregated reports 8 to 12 months later, who is actually verifying the truth on the ground?
That is a massive latency window.
It is like a regional branch manager cooking the books, but corporate headquarters is literally an ocean away and won't even get the audit for a year.
Or 2 years if a ship goes down.
Right. An archive-producing machine separated by thousands of miles of ocean is a perfect breeding ground for massive information asymmetry.
The delay inherent in oceanic travel was a constant. I'm not denying that. And the principal agent problem was absolutely real. But for the first century of its existence, the VOC structure successfully mitigated that asymmetry through the sheer scale of its mechanical loop.
Scale hides a lot of sense.
It does. When the field intelligence improved the cargo choices in Batavia, the resulting profits back in Amsterdam attracted more capital. That capital funded an even wider field network. Each cycle made the company smarter and better capitalized.
But the data advantage was entirely theoretical until it was enforced. That brings us to Gear 6.
Enforcement.
Because information without monopoly power is just a suggestion. It does not matter if you know exactly where the best nutmeg is grown if the English can just sail up right behind you and buy it for a higher price.
Which forces us to confront the truly uncomfortable reality of how this machine protected its information. The VOC's monopoly was not maintained by superior logistics alone.
Not at all.
It was enforced by cannons.
Violence was the company's ultimate data moat. And we really have to look at the Banda Islands in 1621 to understand this.
Jan Peter Soon Koen again.
Yes, the same man who founded the Batavia control room. He led a massive, brutal military campaign against the Bandani's people.
The Banda Islands were the world's only source of nutmeg and mace at the time.
The only source. And the local leaders there wanted to trade freely. They wanted to trade with the English, the Portuguese, and the local Asian networks. It was good business for them.
But the VOC demanded an absolute monopsony.
They demanded to be the sole buyer, and when the Bandanese resisted that demand, Kuhn violently imposed Dutch control. The VOC systematically decimated the local population. They killed their leaders, and they replaced them with Dutch plantation owners using enslaved labor.
It's a horrific chapter. But strategically, and I'm speaking purely from the cold mechanics of the business model here, this was not random, chaotic cruelty.
No, it was entirely calculated.
It was the structural use of coercion to turn fragile commercial knowledge into a closed, enforceable loop. By eliminating local resistance and utterly terrifying the English out of the region, the VOC ensured that their intelligence regarding nutmeg supply could not be exploited by anyone else.
They secured the asset through sheer terror.
The militarization of the VOC's operations is an undeniable historical fact. Violence functioned as the blunt enforcement mechanism for their information edge. The company realized that to maintain a presence in locations where the immediate payoff was strategic intelligence and absolute supply control, they had to act like a state.
They had to absorb the costs of a state.
Right. To preserve a monopoly on a specific island, they had to absorb massive military losses in one season, just to guarantee immense, unchallenged commercial margins for the next 50 years.
But look at the cost of that enforcement. The fixed costs of maintaining that monopoly, the sprawling warehouses, the stone forts, the network of agents, the permanent garrisons of soldiers, and the massive naval fleets required to patrol the archipelago, the overhead was staggering.
It was. But from a purely analytical standpoint, for more than a century, that militarized cost structure was exactly what generated their world-beating dividends.
You think it justified itself?
Financially, yes. It allowed them to enforce exclusive treaties, dictate pricing terms to local rulers, and maintain a vice grip on the most lucrative commodities on Earth.
I see the logic, but
A standard merchant syndicate could never justify the capital expenditure required to build a fort in Ambon and garrison it for 50 years. The VOC's permanent capital structure made that long-term strategic investment possible.
I understand the financial logic of the time. I really do, but we have to ask, when does a moat become a prison?
A prison?
Yes. This exact militarization is the moment the VOC planted the seeds of its own destruction. By relying on an ever-expanding network of physical forts and permanent garrisons to protect its data edge, the VOC transformed from an agile maritime information network into a massive fixed-cost administrative state.
You're arguing the infrastructure itself became a burden.
It became an anchor. I mean, when your gross margins are astronomically high, as they were with monopolized nutmeg and clothes, a militarized cost structure looks like absolute dominance. The revenue from the spice sales easily covers the massive military overhead.
Right. The math works.
But an organization optimized entirely for the coercive control of a single scarce resource is inherently brittle. The world changed, and the VOC's institutional memory paralyzed its ability to learn.
Let's methodically examine that decline then, because the late 18th century collapse of the VOC is a masterclass in organizational failure.
It truly is.
They hit multiple walls simultaneously. Let's break down the 5 fatal flaws.
First, the cost structure itself simply collapsed under its own weight. The military ballast began to heavily outweigh the commercial margins.
Maintaining an imperial footprint across the entirety of the Indian Ocean, from the Cape of Good Hope all the way to Japan, drained their capital reserves faster than the spice trade could replenish them.
Exactly. And second, the principal agent problem we discussed earlier materialized completely in the form of rampant corruption.
The distance finally caught up with them.
It did. The insiders and local officials in Asia understood the local nodes far better than the Heron X-17 back in Amsterdam did.
And because they knew the directors were 12 months away, they utilized that information asymmetry to engage in massive illicit private trade.
VOC officials were literally using company ships, company forts, and company capital to trade on their own private accounts.
Smuggling for their own pockets.
They extracted the actual value of the network for themselves, while leaving the massive fixed costs of the military infrastructure entirely on the company's balance sheet.
That's devastating. And third, they faced the wall of imitation.
The British.
Yes, the VOC's model was so successful that it fundamentally changed how rival nations operated. The British East India Company studied the Dutch playbook and adopted it.
They utilized joint stock finance, chartered monopolies, armed trade, and they built their own local intelligence networks.
Once the British copied the visible mechanics of the model, the VOC no longer had a unique structural advantage.
They needed organizational adaptability to compete at that point. They needed to outmaneuver the British, not just outgun them. But they couldn't, which leads directly to the fourth wall, the massive portfolio shift in global consumer demand.
This is the death blow.
For over a century, the VOC was optimized to violently guard a few tiny islands that produced incredibly scarce spices like nutmeg and cloves. But by the 1700s, consumer demand in Europe was moving rapidly towards textiles, tea, and coffee.
And those are fundamentally different markets. Textiles and tea are much larger markets, but they are also highly competitive.
You cannot physically control the production of cotton in India or tea in China with a few strategically placed cannons.
Exactly. A corporate machine rigidly optimized to build fortresses and execute monopolies could not pivot its massive fixed cost infrastructure to compete in an agile, credit-driven, highly fragmented textile market.
The British were simply better at the textile trade because their structure was less burdened by the rigid administrative memory of the spice monopoly.
And the final wall was geopolitical war,
The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War,
which ran from 1780 to 1784, and it was catastrophic. It devastated VOC credit in Europe and exposed the glaring maritime weakness of the Dutch Republic.
British naval power completely disrupted the VOC's shipping lines. The ships couldn't return to Amsterdam, the goods couldn't be sold, and the company financially collapsed under its debt load.
The critical takeaway here is the internal rot. The information still flowed into Amsterdam.
The letters were still arriving.
The Generali Missiven were still being written. The Huron 17 still knew exactly what was happening. But the organization had too many veto points, too many legacy constraints, and too many entrenched interests to actually act on the data. The archive became useless.
You are saying the organization basically forgot how to process its own intelligence.
I am saying that information without adaptive governance simply becomes administrative memory. The machine stopped learning. It stopped optimizing. It simply recorded its own demise, meticulously documenting every single lost ship and missed quota, leading right up to its formal dissolution in 1799.
The formal dissolution of the VOC in 1799 marked the end of the legal entity. It was absorbed by the Batavian Republic under the influence of the French Revolution. But, and this is where we pivot, the end of the VOC was certainly not the end of its blueprint.
The blueprint survived perfectly.
Because the VOC's architectural design, a structure where form entirely follows an information edge, is the exact blueprint utilized by the most powerful technology monopolies operating today.
Let's trace those modern parallels, because the pattern recognition here is just striking.
Take Amazon. We collectively think of Amazon as a retail company or, a cloud computing giant, but its actual engine, the machine at the center of it all, is a massive, self-reinforcing information loop.
Every single search query typed into that bar.
Every click, every fulfillment metric, every third-party merchant action, and every real-time pricing adjustment feeds into a telemetry system.
And that telemetry coordinates global supply and demand. The physical warehouses, those massive fulfillment centers, strategically placed outside major cities, they are just the modern equivalents of the VOC's spice depots in Batavia or the Cape of Good Hope.
Exactly. The true competitive moat is the coordination layer. The software operates exactly like the Governor General in Batavia, constantly routing decisions based on field intelligence gathered from billions of endpoints.
The historical parallel holds up beautifully. The VOC required permanent capital, sovereign power, and a centralized middle layer because of the specific, physical, geographic nature of its information edge.
Today's titans require completely different physical inputs, but the underlying organizational theory is absolutely identical.
Look at TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Their competitive moat is not simply having the capital to build advanced fabrication plants.
No,
Anyone with enough sovereign backing can pour concrete and buy lithography machines.
TSMC's true moat is their deeply accumulated process knowledge. They gather defect patterns, yield data, and production learning across a vast global network of fabless customers and equipment vendors.
Every mistake made on a wafer teaches the central system how to adjust.
Exactly. The physical fabs themselves are merely the physical manifestation of decades of collected data. They have an institutional memory that cannot be replicated simply by spending money.
Or consider the major payment networks like Visa and MasterCard. They do not merely move money from point A to point B.
No, they maintain the settlement logic. They run the fraud risk algorithms.
They hold the behavioral histories of global commerce. The payment network remembers every transaction, and that permanent memory standardizes trust across the entire ecosystem.
They have built a modern information industrial complex around the flow of capital exactly as the VOC built one around the flow of maritime trade.
And this is exactly where I think the modern platforms diverge from the fatal trajectory of the VOC. The fatal flaw of the Dutch East India Company, the thing that allowed the principal agent rot to hollow out the company, was latency.
The 12-month delay?
Yes, Amsterdam had to wait an agonizing 8 to 12 months for a ship to return with the aggregated reports from Batavia. By the time the board of directors read the intelligence, the political reality on the ground in Asia had already shifted entirely.
A local ruler they ordered to be placated might already be dead.
Or a market they ordered to be flooded with silver might already be suffering severe inflation.
So you are arguing that modern technology fundamentally breaks the VOC's cycle of decay?
I am arguing that modern telemetry solves the latency problem completely. Amazon processes consumer demand signals in milliseconds. Visa adjusts its fraud risk models in real time across millions of concurrent transactions.
But does speed actually equal adaptability?
I think it does. Modern joint stock structures and the instantaneous transmission of data make these new information complexes vastly more adaptable. Because the feedback loops are instantaneous, the central hub never loses touch with the edge nodes. The modern platforms are effectively immune to the specific type of bureaucratic decay and principal agent rot that brought down the VOC. They have the skill to remember the entire market, but the speed to learn from it continuously.
I have to firmly push back on that. Speed does not equal adaptability.
You don't think the speed of data transmission changes the organizational dynamics?
Processing data in milliseconds means absolutely nothing if the human organizational structure responsible for acting on that data is paralyzed by its own scale. I want to introduce the concept of platform bureaucracy.
Okay. Explain platform bureaucracy.
Modern technology platforms face the exact same existential threats as the VOC, just translated into a digital context. Think about local managers at a major tech firm manipulating internal metrics to secure their bonuses, while secretly degrading the actual user experience.
Right. Gaming the system.
That is the exact modern equivalent of VOC officials engaging in illicit private trade on company ships. They are extracting value from the platform for themselves while leaving the technical debt on the company's balance sheet.
But, a modern tech firm can audit those metrics instantly. The Harrier 17 couldn't.
The audit only matters if the leadership has the capacity to understand it and the political will to change it. As these platforms grow, their internal compliance layers multiply. Entire divisions within modern tech monopolies exist solely to manage the internal complexity of the company itself.
The organization becomes entirely inward-facing.
Completely. Legacy infrastructures and outdated code bases survive for years simply because the organization is too massive and no single engineer understands the whole truth of the system anymore. Changing a core algorithm becomes as politically difficult as convincing the Harrier 17 to abandon the Spice Islands.
That's a strong parallel.
Rivals can look at Amazon or TSMC and copy the visible dashboard, the outward-facing features of the model, just like the British copied the VOC. But if the incumbent is weighed down by vicious internal politics and the sheer cost of maintaining its own bureaucratic mass, the underlying data edge slowly dies. The speed of the data transmission cannot save an organization that has lost the structural capacity to change its mind.
So, we have tracked the life cycle of the VOC from a brilliant solution to a fragmented maritime problem, all the way to its collapse under the weight of its own administrative architecture.
And the ultimate lesson we have uncovered today is far deeper than a simple mandate for modern companies to just be data-driven.
Being data-driven is just a baseline requirement today. It's not a moat.
Exactly. The real takeaway is structural. An organization's capital structure, its incentive models, its chain of authority, and its institutional memory must be engineered entirely around the specific nature of its information edge.
Form follows function.
Yes. If the edge is physical logistics and supply control, the capital must be structured to sustain massive physical networks. If the edge is process manufacturing, the institution must be designed to compound specialized learning across decades.
The VOC dominated the 17th century because it perfectly aligned its permanent capital and its centralized authority with the harsh realities of oceanic trade. It failed when the world shifted, and it could no longer adapt that rigid structure to a new reality.
Information advantages inevitably age. They follow a highly predictable trajectory. They began as a sharp, disruptive insight into a market inefficiency.
And then that insight is systematized into a mechanical process.
That process grows into a sprawling institution.
And finally, that institution faces an existential choice. It either finds a way to ruthlessly renew itself, stripping away the accumulated administrative weight, or it decays into hollow ritual, simply going through the motions of dominance long after the actual advantage has faded.
We have mapped the anatomy of the first great information industrial complex, and the parallels to our current era are undeniable. Look closely at today's data-rich incumbents.
The final question we must leave you with is this. Look at the massive tech platforms that organize our modern world. Are there incredibly sophisticated information machines still actively learning from the market, adapting to new realities and renewing their edge? Or are they merely recording the world as bureaucracy slowly takes over?
This is the Research Desk, officially signing off.